veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator. Presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO.
Frank McIntyre at the microphone. I have never in my life belonged to a labor union. This doesn't mean that I am in any way anti-union. In fact, my views, which some people consider liberal, are quite often in line with the views of labor. I've never belonged to a union, though, because there was no such thing as a broadcast employees union when I was an announcer, and by the time AFRA, the American Federation of Radio Announcers, and later AFTRA, with television added, came along, I was on the management side of the table and wasn't eligible, even though I manage and own a business. Said business being a struggling FM station in Ogden, I still consider myself a worker. I can do anything my employees do, except for engineering, and in fact do it. I probably am more sympathetic with the worker as opposed to the manager than many managers and owners, because I'm on the firing line with the workers. I know what they do to earn the paltry salaries I'm able to pay them. Their paltry salaries, however, are more than I pay myself. I have yet to take a salary from my station. However, as an owner, I do enjoy the appreciation of the property. Now, what all of this is leading up to is this. I've been looking into the so-called right-to-work law, which I happen not to like, and which I opposed when it was introduced in Idaho when I was a Gem State broadcaster. I was opposed to the law, which didn't pass, incidentally, because the name was a fraud. Had it been honestly named, for instance, the union inhibiting law, I might have favored it. Who knows? But I was offended by the patently dishonest title. I wonder about the law. We have it in Utah. Is there any connection between the so-called right-to-work law and the fact that Utah is in 39th place out of 50 states in per capita income, according to the U.S. Department of Commerce figures? Who's 38? Just above us? North Dakota, a right-to-work state. Who's number 40, just below us? South Dakota, another right-to-work state. In 1955, when Utah passed the right-to-work law, our state was $251 below the national average per capita income. In 1972, we were $764 below the average per capita income. So is there a connection? I don't know for sure, but I kind of think so. For instance, every state that's passed so-called right-to-work laws, with the exception of Nevada, have dropped much lower on the scale of average per capita income than the same state was before the passage of compulsory open shop legislation. I wonder if the law is helping or hurting our state. And I'm asking the question from the point of view of a businessman who is interested in a profit. Frank McIntyre at the microphone. One man's opinion.
One man's opinion with Frank C. McIntyre, veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator, has been presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO. This is One Man's Opinion, featuring Frank C. McIntyre, veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator, presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO.
Frank McIntyre at the microphone. We'll be talking all this week about a very controversial subject, Utah's so-called right-to-work law. I say so-called, because the law does not give anyone the right to work. I'm opposed to the law, and please understand, I am a businessman. I own, or I'm buying, a radio station. I manage the station. I am an employer. Maybe you think that I should be in favor of the law, but I happen to agree with U.S. Senator George D. Aiken of Vermont, the ranking Republican member of the Senate Agriculture Committee, who said, union-busting legislation under any name whatsoever will drive a wedge between laboring people and the employers of labor. It would establish political parties on a labor or anti-labor basis, to the exclusion of other vitally important philosophies. I think you'll have to agree that Senator Aiken is hardly a wild-eyed leftist. He's not even what we usually think of as a liberal. So I suggest you pay heed to his words directed especially to the farmers. Speaking of the so-called right-to-work law, Senator Aiken says, "It would definitely pave the way for abolition of marketing orders for farmers. If labor is denied the right to organize effectively, so can farmers be denied the right to organize themselves into farm cooperatives for bargaining purposes." Well, that's equal justice, isn't it? Let's pass a law that won't let any segment of our society organize for bargaining purposes. Let's pass a law that'll keep everybody under control. Let's not let anyone organize. Not just the workers, but the farmers and the doctors and the lawyers and the building contractors and the broadcasters. But of course, right-to-work laws don't operate that way. They are clearly aimed at unions and only at unions. There are some politicians who would seek to drive a wedge between the farmer and labor. But let's quote John S. Watson, past president, Associated Farmers of California, a powerful farm organization. He says, "For the life of me, I can't see how, in conscience or in logic, a farmer can oppose labor's right to have a union shop. Most farmers invoke marketing agreements which provide that if 2/3 of the farmers marketing at least 1/2 of a crop vote for a set of marketing rules, all of the producers are legally bound to market according to these rules." Yet, the so-called right-to-work law would make it illegal to sign contracts providing for a union shop, even if 99% of the workers vote for it. As I've said before on this microphone, I first became suspicious of the misnamed right-to-work law many years ago in Idaho, when it became obvious to me that the title was a phony, a fraud. I wondered, why would a good law have a dishonest name? In fact, the courts have held that the catchphrase "right to work" is inaccurate and misleading. More tomorrow on this vital subject. Frank McIntyre at the microphone. One man's opinion.
One Man's Opinion with Frank C. McIntyre, veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator, has been presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO. This is One Man's Opinion, featuring Frank C. McIntyre, veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator, presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO.
Frank McIntyre at the microphone. I wonder, when the so-called right-to-work law was passed by the Utah legislature a few years ago, what voices other than those of labor unions were heard in opposition. I doubt very much if you heard both sides. Labor obviously was opposed to the law. And because of their vested interest in maintaining a closed shop, you probably felt their protests against the right-to-work law lacked genuine credibility. But were other voices heard? Did the area newspapers or radio and TV stations present the other side of the coin? I don't know. I was in Idaho at the time. But let's, at this late date, continue to point out some of the reasons I feel Utah was sold a bill of goods that really weren't too good for us. I became suspicious of the bill some years ago when I was an Idaho broadcaster, suspicious because of the title. It was not by any stretch of the imagination a right-to-work law, simply because it does not protect anybody's right to work. As the St. Louis Post-Dispatch points out, such measures are not sponsored by workers. A right-to-work law prohibits the closed shop, union shop, or other union security arrangements or contracts, even if a large majority of the employees favor them. The New York Daily News summed it up by stating, "A right-to-work law does not guarantee anybody a job. or a right to a job. The Louisville Courier-Journal says, large employers have passed the trial and error period in their relationships with unions, and they prefer to deal with unions under contract than to return to the old guerrilla warfare. Back to this fraudulent title. Right to work sounds as American as apple pie. What could be more American than to allow a worker an opportunity to have a job? Nothing could be more American. But as we've said before, the law does not guarantee anybody a right to work. It's interesting to note, especially significant in fact, that the courts in both Colorado and Idaho have held that the catchphrases right to work or freedom to work are inaccurate and misleading. Wonder why the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Farm Bureau Federation would want to be associated with anything that carries a label that's been found by the courts of the land, to be inaccurate and misleading. I'm opposed to the right-to-work law, but all I ask is that if and when the issue comes up again in our state legislature, that it will be faced openly and honestly, and we'll know exactly what we're buying. Frank McIntyre at the microphone, One Man's Opinion.
One Man's Opinion with Frank C. McIntyre, veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator, has been presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO. This is One Man's Opinion, featuring Frank C. McIntyre, veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator, presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO.
Frank McIntyre at the microphone. In my nosing about trying to find out all I could about the so-called right-to-work law, I ran across an article by Ed Emerine, editor, Idaho Farm Journal. Ed, who was born on a Colorado homestead and has worked as a dirt farmer, says he never cared for the farmer in the gray flannel suit who goes about telling farmers what to do. He says, I believe in God, the Ten Commandments, and the Golden Rule, and if I thought or I could find any evidence that a right-to-work law would help the farmer, I'd charge right out like a bull and fight for it. Instead, I'm against it. Ed continues, I've never held a union card in my life, but I don't like to see farmers used by National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to put over schemes that in the long run will probably hurt the farmer most of all. Here's Ed's reasoning. He says, the fellow living in town is the farmer's customer. Give him decent wages, and he'll buy good food for his family, and he'll see that they have clothes on their backs. Once he is out of a job, or his wages are lowered under a right-to-work law, he'll have to pass up the steak and butter counter and go around where the old bull bologna and oleo is sold. Ed Emerine points out, too, that farmers and others are unionizing for collective bargaining more and more. The editor of the Idaho Farm Journal continues, Grade A milk producers organized a pretty tight union to bargain with processors. Fruit and vegetable growers learned long ago to form co-ops and bargain collectively for marketing. Listen to this analogy. That's what a labor union is for, to form a co-op for collective bargaining to sell its product, which is not squash or sugar beets, but muscle and skill. That makes good old American sense to me. Let me point out to those of you who are foursquare behind the right-to-work law, why not apply the same principle right down the line instead of discriminating against the laborer? In other words, the right-to-work law is, and you cannot discriminate, you cannot deny it, it's discriminatory because it's aimed at only one single class. As farm editor Emerine points out, it doesn't apply to the lawyers who operate a closed shop that sets pretty high fees for any legal work. It doesn't apply to the doctors of medicine, the Doctor of Medicine Union, which shunts you around from specialist to specialist, doing a little more than the country doctor who got to the homestead just in time to deliver me as a baby. treat Dad's hernia and sprained ankle and show Mother what to do about the measles and whatever else the other kids in our house had at the time. You rural people should listen carefully to this part of Farm Editor Emmerine's statement. Perhaps my biggest gripe about these right-to-work proposals is that they always come from Washington, D.C., or New York City, or some other place far removed from farmers. And he goes on to say, I've never seen one of these bills that was written by a farmer, but they always figure out that they can get the farmers to carry the ball, and all too often they succeed. Ed Emmerine, editor, Idaho Farm Journal, has a lot more to say about the so-called right-to-work laws. Ed, makes sense. I urge you all to look at both sides of this issue. Maybe you'll conclude, as did I, that the right-to-work law is not a blessing for the state of Utah. Frank McIntyre at the microphone, One Man's Opinion.
One Man's Opinion with Frank C. McIntyre, veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator, has been presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO. This is One Man's Opinion, featuring Frank C. McIntyre, veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator, presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO.
Frank McIntyre at the microphone. Before we conclude this series on the right-to-work law, a misnamed law, if there ever was one, we ought to re-emphasize a few points that we touched earlier. The so-called right-to-work law starts off by the very name in being a fraud, nothing less than a fraud. As one writer pointed out, it is deceptive and insidious. And we ought to remind you again that the courts in Idaho and Colorado have found the catchphrases right to work and freedom to work to be inaccurate and misleading. The courts have found the phrases to be inaccurate and misleading because the so-called right-to-work law does not give every worker the right to a job and to receive work at fair wages, reasonable hours, and under decent labor conditions and standards. It does not mean that every worker has a right to secure employment with proper provisions for paid vacations and insurance safeguards against sickness and old age. It does not mean that every worker is protected against arbitrary discharge, and it certainly does not strengthen the individual worker's bargaining position through a union of his choice. What it does mean is that the worker's bargaining position is weakened. It's practically non-existent. It creates an open shop. It destroys the institution of collective bargaining and keeps our workers abnormally low on the economic scale. It means the wrecking of the whole structure of labor union democracy and effective labor management relations. Abnormally low on the economic scale. That's what I said, and that's what I meant. Utah is number 39 in the nation, 39 in per capita income. Utah passed the so-called right-to-work law in 1955. At that time, back in 1955, Utah was $251 below the national average per capita income. In 1972, Utah was not $251 below the national average. We were $764 below. 251 below the national average in 55 when the right-to-work law was passed, and in the ensuing 17 years, by 1972, we dropped to $764 below the national average. Is that progress? It is certainly not progress for Utah's working people, and most of us are working people. Every state in the Union with a right-to-work law, except Nevada, has a below the national average per capita income. This is something we have to face, and face honestly. We have to find the answer. Is the right-to-work law responsible? I happen to think the answer is yes. The evidence is overwhelming. It's hurting me. It's hurting our citizens. It's hurting you. It's hurting each and every one of us. It's hurting us in our pocketbooks. Our citizens have a below-average income. They have less to spend, and this means that Utah businessmen sell less. I've talked to responsible and knowledgeable credit counselors in our state who point out that thousands and thousands of Utahns are in financial trouble. They can't pay their bills. Inflation, naturally, is partially responsible. But a great deal of the blame must also rest with the right-to-work law. I ask that you study the law and not be guided by the slogans which have been uttered in ringing tones of idealism and individual liberty. Please remember, the courts have found those slogans to be inaccurate and misleading. Frank McIntyre at the microphone, One Man's Opinion.
One Man's Opinion with Frank C. McIntyre, veteran Utah broadcaster and syndicated commentator, has been presented by the Utah State AFL-CIO.
Now, the thing's recording right now. You got both those buttons down. She's recording. And if you want to stop any place,